do any announcements or anything, or not? Okay.
Yes, just thank you very much, Venerable, for being here.
Oh, I wasn't hinting. It's okay.
I got the talking to by Venerable once. He said, aren't you introducing me? I'm like, I just already told everyone who you were. It was very funny.
Oh, funny. Okay, yeah, no. I got introduced quite a lot last week, so I think we're okay. Everybody knows who I am. Even the new people might know who I am. Okay, we'll begin. So welcome everybody to night 3 of Cultivating Emotional Balance, and I know we've got some new people. We'll review not everything we did last week, but the latest thing that we did last week, which was this chart called the Emotional Episode Timeline. And so what we've been talking about in our Cultivating Emotional Balance class is bringing awareness and choice to our emotional life. Last week we talked a lot about what emotions are, the definition of emotion, that they actually have a function. So our job is not to try and kind of somehow wipe out our emotional life. That's not the job either of Buddhism or of this cultivating emotional balance modality. But it's more about learning more about our emotions, bringing awareness to our emotions, and then creating choice about how and when and where we're emotional, right? And how we express our emotions, whether they're more in a constructive way or a destructive way. And so we talked about this quite a lot last week for those of you that were here. We don't talk so much in this program about positive and negative emotions. You'll hear those phrases thrown around a lot. Oh, positive and negative emotions. And that's more kind of from the sense of how does it feel subjectively to feel that emotion. Whereas in cultivating emotional balance, we talk more in terms of the terminology of constructive and destructive emotional episodes or emotional behaviors. And it's more in terms of how beneficial is this to my own and others' well-being in a deeper way, because there might be emotions that don't feel so good, but are actually can be expressed really constructively. And we talked about some examples. Can anybody remember an example or a new one of an emotion that may be considered negative in terms of the feeling, but is constructive in terms of sort of the outcome or the behavior, both for yourself and others' well-being? Anybody think of an example or remember one of the ones we talked about last week?
Is it like getting angry at a child who's running out to the street or something like that?
Yeah. So we talked about that, like a mother whose child is running out into the street yells, manifests, grabbing them back. Maybe, these days nobody spanks them. When I was growing up, you'd get a spanking, for running into the street. So it's manifesting. That would not be the time to go, oh, Johnny, honey, don't, go out there. I mean, Johnny's already flattened by the garbage truck by then, so it's definitely, manifesting something. We also talked about sadness. And sadness, the function of sadness is to elicit comfort in the face of a shared loss. We talked about a lot of these emotions that have a universal facial signal. Remember, we went through 7 emotions that have this universal facial signal, which shows that we evolved to express these emotions to others because they had a function in expressing them. And you can imagine when we lived in a small little tribe or troop, of closely related, kin and friends, if we showed that sad face, it would elicit comfort and connection with others in the face of a loss that everybody was sharing. And we experience that now. You go to a memorial service, and people are crying, they're expressing sadness, sometimes they're telling stories. We talked about this last week too. Grief is complex, and it's not just sadness, because grieving can have laughter in there, and remembering the person, and joy. So the whole process of grieving is quite complex. We wouldn't say that's a single emotion, but we also express sadness, and then we do elicit comfort. Now, it doesn't always work. And we need to figure out, when are we going to express that sadness? You don't necessarily want to go to work the next day around a bunch of people you're not necessarily close to. There might not be that trust established and express that same signal of that emotion. So we say that there's different display rules about emotional signals, and we all know, if you just think, times that you express an emotion on your face or somehow in your behavior or your voice, and then you'll just turn it off in another situation. You know, at work, for example, versus with your friends. Very, very different emotional expression in those situations, you know, not necessarily the same kind of emotional expression. So we say sadness doesn't necessarily feel good, but it does serve a function and it can be constructive. It would feel really inappropriate to go into the same memorial service and start handing out your business card and schmoozing and, like, you know, networking and laughing or something. You'd just be like, how heartless, you know? It's an appropriate emotion to show in that circumstance. And then we said there's ones that can be pleasant to feel, but destructive. What would an example of a destructive, enjoyable emotion be? You ready to think of any? You're pointing, Mary Jane. Who are you pointing at?
Last week I said revenge.
Yeah, revenge. Sweet revenge, right? Or, you know, we talked about that German word Schadenfreude, which means like rejoicing in others', you know, misfortune. And, you know, the really annoying person at work is getting a divorce, and you hear the gossip through the rumor mill. It's going horribly and it's getting bitter, and you're like, oh, that's terrible. Tell me more about it. You know, that. And we have that. We have that. Actually, for those of you, I'm going to put my Buddhist hat on for a minute. Well, I don't have to put on the hat. I've got the whole outfit. But we talk about the 10 non-virtues, and there's one that, if for those of you that were in the course last weekend when we talked about karma, maliciousness or ill will. And that rejoicing in others' misfortune is a flavor of that maliciousness. You know, it's like we're not plotting for the person's downfall, but we're certainly pretty happy about it when it happens, you know, for the people that we dislike. And then I said all those supermarket tabloids, I think they're just based on that emotion of the rich and famous people that we're jealous of. We're happy. You know, I just saw this thing, I mean, after the weekend and the presidential debate and all of this, and we don't have to go into all of those details, but I love Samantha Bee, and she had this whole thing about how we love the wronged wives, and then she's like, you know, we're still feeling sorry for Jennifer Aniston, and Brad Pitt's already now broken up with the person he cheated on her with, but we're still like you know, we feel sorry for her. And it's sort of like all of that, oh, somebody cheated on somebody, let me read all about it. Like, it's just, you know, that thing, isn't it, of those magazines and things of like full of that. And that's that emotion of like Schadenfreude, like being pleased at somebody else's misfortune, especially if we're jealous of them. And that's interesting because jealousy is not one of the emotions that has a universal signal. So we don't always want people to know that we're jealous. So it didn't evolve a universal facial signal, right? So jealousy, there's some emotions that probably are universal. I don't know that anybody studied jealousy in every culture on the planet, but I would imagine that would be one that would be pretty universal. But it didn't have a facial signal because it wasn't somehow functional to express that emotion on your face in a way that other people could read. You'd want to mask that. And we try and mask a lot of emotions. We don't always succeed. Sometimes we talk about micro expressions. Sometimes our emotions kind of leak through, even when we're trying to mask them. There's like a very, very subtle expression, or it just sort of will show it for just an instant. And the emotions researcher that developed this training from the psychological side, Paul Ekman, that some of you may have heard from, he trains people how to figure out if people are lying. And one of the techniques is an interview or an interrogation by the police or an interview at immigration or something, and he'll slow down the tape And sometimes these micro expressions will just flash. They're so quick, we can't see them consciously at normal speed, but when he slows down the tape of the interview, sometimes they'll leak through. And he decided, he trains people, if the person's expression is at odds with what they're saying, with their words, chances are they're lying about something. So if there's a disconnect between the signal, and usually when people are lying, they're trying to mask their face, but often it can be that, and then there'll be sort of a micro expression leaking through them. So then we started talking about this, and somebody else just came in. I've got a handout for you if you want to. No, it's all right. No. Sorry about that. Sorry to call you out. I just want to make sure you got a handout. I'm not reprimanding you. I'm just getting you ready for what's... Okay. So we talked about this emotional episode timeline, and we'll review this. And then we did some exercises, and not all of you were here, so yippee, the people who were here last Thursday, you get to display your emotional episode to all the rest of the people. We've got 3 left of our workshop part. So this is breaking down an entire emotional episode into its component parts. And so we've got the precondition, the trigger, which is a combination of the precondition, the event, and the perception database. The state, which has both physical and psychological changes, and constructive or destructive actions, and then the post-condition. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is keep referring to your chart, because Les asked, can we get some more definitions around these things? And so I prepared a slide where we're going to really kind of talk more in detail about what these things are. I kind of said it verbally last week, but I know there was a little bit of confusion. So let's look at these before we look at some of the charts from last week. So the precondition are intentions. So part of the precondition is, what kind of motivation do you go into that experience, that episode with? There may not be one necessarily. There isn't necessarily an intention or motivation before any event. We're just going about our business, just trying to cope, make it through our day. But sometimes there is a specific intention that we go into a situation with that can add to whatever emotion arises. So looking at that, that's part of the precondition. Also part of the precondition, existing psychological and physiological states. So for me, if I'm hungry and sleep deprived, forget it. It's just going to be a train wreck, almost anything. Like, I just know I need to take a nap and take care of my, needs, because I just am so cranky when I'm sleepy and, having one of those blood sugar crises. It's just bad, right? So I think a lot of us probably share that physiological state. And then psychological state, if we're already emotional about something, or we're stressed or anxious or fearful or whatever it may be, that's all part of the precondition going into that event. And then the trigger. So you see on your chart, there's the event that happens. That could be either internal or external stimuli. So could be something happens. Someone says something to you, something happens to you in terms of an external event. It could be an internal stimuli, a memory, for example, a realization, you figure something out about somebody's motivation, about any of these things. It could be either coming internally from a thought process that you're having, or externally from some kind of stimulus. And then that triggers our automatic appraisal, which leads to emotions and responses. And we said, when we're emotional, there's a kind of automatic appraisal going on. And this is the part that's very evolutionary for us and very functional. We have this automatic appraisal of stimuli, not necessarily conceptual. When something happens, we just get emotional immediately. We're not going through this thought process. And I just gave the, evolutionary example of you're driving along in your car and something darts out in front. It might just be a leaf, but you slam your brakes on. You're not thinking, oh, brown object crossing the road, it could be a sentient being, I better slam. It's going to be squashed by then. It's just this automatic thing, right? So that automatic appraisal that we have. And so internal or external stimuli trigger that, which then leads to emotions and responses. And then you'll see at the bottom of that trigger is the perception database. So that's information on what it is that automatically triggers our emotions. So some of it is universal and just evolutionary. For example, an object flying at you through the air, you're going to duck. I mean, you don't have to think about it, you're just going to duck. Or a sudden loss of gravity, right? If this chair collapsed, I would have a fear response, right? That's just an evolutionary thing about falling off the cliff or whatever it might be. So some things like that are just universal for all human beings. A lot of it is personal. So in that perception database is both the universal and the personal, what is learned from our individual experience. And as it says here, it's an open system. Information is being added to that all the time. And I gave an example last week about my own experience. I live in the mountains in Central California in a place called Santa Cruz, and there's lots and lots of deer in the mountains. And getting to where I live, I have to drive these winding mountain roads through the forest. And there's always deer by the side of the road, and it's always just this fear that you're going to hit a deer. And so in April, it happened, finally. I was driving along at night, and this deer just leaped from the side of the road, and I didn't even see it until, So it's given me a new data point in my perception database. I've turned into one of those old ladies that doesn't drive at night. I'm like, that's it, not driving at night anymore. I don't drive on the road where it happened, even though it doesn't make sense at all, because there's deer everywhere, but I just have this total PTSD about that one road and about what happened. So it's this new thing of, and then if I see a deer by the side of the road, I'd always put my brakes on, but now I'm just like, right? So a new kind of trigger point, right, from that experience that I had. So it's always happening. It's not just what happened when you were 4 years old. Even though we say things that happen very early in life and that happened a lot are in there deep. This is when I was discussing, as I mentioned, with Paul Ekman. His daughter, Eve Ekman, is also an emotions researcher, and she teaches these classes with me. And we have this big debate. Paul Ekman and Eve believes her dad that these things can never be completely uprooted. But being a good Buddhist, I say there's nothing that can't be purified. So we have this fight. We have a fight about anger too. We're going to talk about that later tonight. The Buddhist view and the psychological view. Psychological view is you can work with these and really attenuate them. But Paul Ekman says they're never completely gone. And I say, I think they can be completely gone, but that's my Buddhist hat on and my Buddhist view. So the perception database. And then the state. So this is your emotional state, right? So inherited and learned mechanism of information that directs your emotional behavior. So the emotional signals, the expression on your face, the physiological changes, because we were talking about emotions also having accompanying physiology, emotional impulses, and psychological changes. Okay, so it's an open program too. Through learned behavior, emotions can be masked or expressed in unique ways. So we've got more on the chart, but any questions about these pieces before we go on to the next one? Yeah, Chris.
In Buddhist terms, would you call your perceptual database your karma?
In Buddha, it's interesting to actually apply Buddhism to this chart. And that's actually what I did when I did my teacher training for Cultivating Emotional Balance. I did a project that we had to do a final project, and my final project was, how does our Buddhist meditation affect this chart? So we would also add on to that, both for sure in the perception database, we would say, okay, there's evolutionary stuff that just has to do with our karma of being a human being. We react in a certain way. There's personal stuff, you know, which is just kind of learned behavior. And there's our karmic imprints, for sure. We would say those would give us a tendency. They would still need to be ripened, right? They would still need to be ripened by the condition. But our karmic imprints, yeah, I think would be in that perception database of like, do we have a tendency, for example, it might have been that in past lives we're very habituated to anger, so it doesn't take much, we have a short fuse, so that would show up in there. So I think for sure the karmic imprints, that's kind of where karmic imprints would have an influence on that emotional, and the whole timeline. Yeah, good question. Anything else before we go on? Okay. And I know for a lot of you this is a review, but for some of you are just coming tonight. So we'll work through this with a couple of examples also, and hopefully it'll become more clear. And then the selective filtering period, and that's the shaded part right here. A period of narrowed or distorted perception in which we interpret the world in a way consistent with the emotion that we're feeling. And an example of this would be, you know, when we're angry, for example, and the person tries to apologize right away, we're perceiving everything through the filter of that anger. So they try and apologize, and we're like, oh my God, they're being so manipulative now. Right? We can't even hear it. And this is really good to keep in mind. By the way, this functions not only for us, but for everybody else in our lives. And it's really interesting, I think, to think of this when we're in conflict with somebody, because we can think, and I do this now that I'm really well trained in this. I go, oh, they're in their selective filtering period right now. You know, I just need to wait, and we need to, and then you can ask for like a timeout. You know, you give yourself and the other person, just like you do a toddler, you need a timeout. And you give yourself that time because it's no good. It's no good. I mean, I think sometimes, especially if we feel like somebody's mad at us, because like God forbid that everybody doesn't love us 24/7. You know, the world will come to an end, but we try and kind of make it okay, kind of right away. If they're still in it, if they're still really feeling that, they're in that filtering period, and the best thing to do is just take a break and come back later, because they can't hear anything that's not through the lens of what they're going through. And we're going to talk a little bit later tonight about some of the ways we can work with this. Some of the kind of techniques that we can apply to really, you know, do things differently a little bit in our emotional lives on the basis of this. But that one is super important, that selective filtering period. I was talking about, I was mentioning last week, I taught a one-day workshop in Folsom State Prison with the highest level security, like active gang members, these 50 guys in a room. And I was told by the yoga teacher 6 months later, one of the guys was talking about something that was going on for him in yoga class, and he goes, oh, and then I was in that selective filtering period. And I was like, yeah, I remember. And it really changed the way he dealt with whatever was going on, his emotional episode, because she wrote me an email going, oh, you'll be so happy. He couldn't remember the name of it, but he's like, what's that thing when you're seeing everything through like the filter, you know? And he remembered it, and it really kind of helped him deal with the situation that he was in. And then the next is our constructive and destructive actions. And we used to call these, we've changed a lot of the terminology in the chart. We used to call this response and reaction. And reaction was your automatic reaction. just our knee-jerk, mostly dysfunctional, right, way of just reacting to it, like yell back at the person who's yelling at you. You know, that would be destructive. And then the constructive, with awareness and understanding of the impact, then you can choose. That's where the choice comes in. You can choose, and with training, it becomes automatic, even the constructive response. And that's the cool thing. The more you work with this, the more even the constructive response can be completely automatic. One of the other guys in another prison where I teach, he said that, you know, he was trying to practice patience and not getting angry. And, you know, there's a lot of violent confrontations. And he wrote to me a letter once and he said, oh, for the first time, he said, when there would be a violent confrontation, I'd be getting angry at the guy who was threatening me, but I'd feel like, okay, I should be patient. And then he said, one day, the guy was in my face, and the only thing I felt was compassion, just automatically, you know, because of his Buddhist practice. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. He said, I didn't have to talk myself into it or try and stop being angry or do some shenanigans of like, you know, dealing with it. He said, it just came automatically, compassion for the angry person. And he didn't do anything. Like the other guy just backed down because he was being met with this like love and compassion instead of, you know, retaliation. And he just completely backed down. You know, it was quite a violent episode. So that can happen with those constructive actions. We can really habituate to those just the way we have always habituated to an automatic reaction. And then the post-condition, the very last thing, that impact that emotion has. So it can be both external and internal impacts. And we've all experienced the external impact when we engage in some kind of destructive behavior. You yell at somebody, and then it's hard. They don't trust you, maybe for a long time, right? So it can have that kind of impact. Can also have an impact on us, whatever that emotional episode. We're left with an emotion, and you can see on your chart this dotted line going from the post-condition to the precondition. Because, by the way, this is happening all the time. It's not just like you have one of these a day, you know? You can have these like a lot. So our post-condition of one episode can set us up for the precondition of the next emotional episode. And we were talking about emotions being very short-lived. And if you feel like you've been angry for 3 days, you've just been re-triggered over and over and over again. And it probably the anger that you were left with, or like the aftermath of the anger, was a precondition for the next thing that happened. And then something you wouldn't necessarily have reacted to at all, you react to with anger because you're set up for it. It's a precondition, already being emotional. So when people say, oh, I was angry for 3 days, or, you know, you weren't. It was short-acting emotions, but you just kept getting re-triggered over and over and over again. Okay? So any questions about this chart? Anything to clarify? Yeah, Chris.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, sure. Don't be shy.
On the trigger part of it,
Yes.
so I sort of get the external and the internal, but ultimately isn't the reaction an internal one anyway? You know, even if it's an external stimuli, you know, that
Yeah.
you know.
So that state, because that's next. That's the reaction, right, is the state. And then that's physiological. So that's kind of the emotion that you feel as a result of, like, the trigger. But it's interesting to look at the trigger, because something could be triggering for you that's not triggering at all for somebody else. So the event could be the same, but because of your perception database and precondition, right, it could be triggering for you. So yeah, it is an internal response to that that's very personal. And probably you can think of examples where the same thing happened 1 week and you were fine, and then just because, if you're me, you're tired and hungry and, you know, whatever, it'll trigger you. So yeah, it's kind of looking at all three of these things, how they come together. And then the next phase is, this is the emotional reaction.
Is it best to, wait for that emotion to filter through you without judgment and without that stuff? Or can you actually, bring in, through thought training, a way just to change that emotion?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Depending on what's going on. I think if you're, in that, there's a lot of practice that comes in here, and we're going to talk more about it later on tonight, of kind of like, how do we deal with this timeline? And one of the things that's really important, this is a great question, is to determine, is it already that I'm so triggered that the smartest thing to do is just do a 180 and get out of Dodge? Because I'm going to do something that's really destructive right now. And sometimes that's the decision that you make, in judging, when can I transform it? When can I choose to act differently? Or like, when is it just so intense that really, in a completely valid Buddhist practice and cultivating emotional balance practice is, I need a break. Let's talk about this later, or you just like get out of the situation. It's not denial, it's not running away. It's like, if you know that you're going to engage in a destructive action because you're so triggered, and then hopefully slowly use some of the other techniques to work with those triggers, to work with the situation, to, see how much, like what's going on with the perception database, and to the point where you can stay with the situation and deal with it more constructively. But I think the first, one of the first steps is, wow, is it going to be constructive or destructive? Can I even handle this at all right now? Like, is there any way I can manage this and make it into a constructive situation? And kind of determining when that is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and also how to work with really hot triggers. Either we'll get to it later tonight or tomorrow night, like how to work with those really intense triggers. Yeah. Anything else to clarify? Yes?
Sort of on the same note, when a person gets triggered and you get sort of that chemical dumping into your bloodstream, where you've got all this adrenaline, other things that are now, you're under the influence sort of these chemicals. And maybe you're aware of like, oh, okay, now I have that feeling of anxiety or whatever. Could you just talk a little bit about how to work with that when you feel that and you're aware of it, but you're, in a sense, maybe you don't even trust yourself because now I'm drunk on emotion. So
that's right. And we'll do a technique later tonight that's a great technique. Some of you may have heard of this technique. It was founded by a Vipassana teacher called Michelle McDonald Smith, and Tara Brach teaches it a lot. It's called RAIN, the RAIN meditation technique, about how to work with emotions that are, where we feel kind of flooded without emotion. We feel like, I'm not going to respond well to this. How we can kind of work in our meditation practice. And sometimes the question is, get out of the situation and do this practice right away. And you find that it really does help. Even before I knew about the RAIN practice, there was one situation, and I always remember this because I sort of did it even before I kind of knew really what it was. I hadn't learned that practice, but I don't usually get angry much. But in this one situation, I was living in a Dharma center, and there was a couple of other monastics living there, including this monk who was like really, really good friends with me, and we would always have lunch together every day. And one day at lunch, he said this thing, and I was just like, just this, and I was like, whoa, like, oh my God, like that's, I felt this thing in my body, just kind of like, and I was like, wow, I can't believe he said that to me. And even before studying Cultivating Emotional Balance, just out of my Buddhist practice, was like, I better get out of here. Like, this is really bad. And I just stood up and walked away from the lunch table, and everybody's like looking at me. And I went and sat down on my meditation cushion, and I just watched my breath. And I just felt the sensations in my body, like really, really, and I just tried to anchor with my breath and just kind of be with what was happening without like suppressing and without acting out, but just like hang out with it. And almost immediately I realized, oh, he really hurt my feelings. Like he said this thing and I just felt dissed by like one of my best friends, and I wasn't aware of that in the moment, that that was why I was angry. But so much of the time, and we're going to talk about anger tonight too, I think anger can so often be a secondary emotion kind of masking a deeper vulnerability. So often it's fear or hurt feelings or rejection, and then we manifest anger. And I realized that for me in that moment, it was like, oh my gosh, he said that thing and it really hurt my feelings. And then it was amazing. Instantly my anger dissolved because I was already going to this place of, I need to move like today. He lives next door to me. How can I arrange never to see him again? Like I was going to this crazy place in my mind, And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, he hurt my feelings. Okay, I know how to deal with that. And the anger just dissolved because it was really like secondary to this deeper kind of vulnerability. So I went and knocked on his door. He lived next door to me. Like that was really convenient, So I knocked on his door and he opened his door and he's a little bit like, and I said, can we talk? And then we had this conversation. He had no idea that what he'd said would be hurtful. It was just completely a misunderstanding. And then we got to an even deeper level of closeness, but in the moment, I had to leave. Like it wouldn't have been good to stay and deal with it in that moment. I left, I sat down, I watched my breath, I felt the feelings in my body, and almost immediately this, kind of realization of, oh, it's not really fundamentally anger, it's really much more fundamentally, hurt feelings. I feel really dissed. And so it transformed, and so it's a great technique to just kind of like hang out with the emotion. Yeah. So we'll look at that a little bit more later on in that specific practice of rain, and I think that'll give us some more techniques. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? We had some people doing some flip charts last week. Now let's see. And we did one of them together. Was this the one that we did? Oh yeah, this was the one that we did. My questions don't get a response. The superior doesn't get back to me. Where is she? She's not even here today. She was like, no, that was enough. Okay. Uh-oh. They're Post-it flip chart pages. Yikes. Okay, so we've got the one of Mark, Annette, and Dot. It's up to you, Annette. Is Dot here? Who else is here? Yeah? You guys want to do it? Come on. You have to, because Mark's not here. Do you remember? It's okay. You all worked on it. what are those things in our perception database? But I found when I was doing the Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training, I found this emotional episode timeline, because it was new to me, to be super helpful in, because sometimes we feel like something happens that we become emotional about, and we just feel like it's like whoosh, like it's just this instantaneous thing. Whereas when you can divide it into the different little pieces and bring awareness to them, sometimes then, okay, maybe whatever that emotional episode has already happened, but maybe you can bring some awareness and then attenuate somehow. Or you might react destructively, and then you just kind of feel like, I can reflect afterwards what would have been a more constructive way of dealing with this, and kind of think it through a little bit differently. And I gave an example last week about a time recently that something happened, and I felt very triggered. And I went home, kind of followed my own advice, got myself out of the situation, because I knew I was in that selective filtering period and it was going to last a long time. And the other people that were in this situation, I just said, okay, I'm going to go home right now. And they're like, okay. And then I just, kind of self-soothed. I think I took a shower and ate something, and then sat down and did a timeline. And it just brought awareness to what had just happened for me, and so sort of like I got myself out of that refractory period by getting out of the situation and just kind of taking care of myself physically and just taking a break. And then I was really ready to sit down. And there was I made up a list of the perception database. And as I was mentioning last week, it's like this person who triggered me, if he'd known me for 35 years, he couldn't have hit the nail on the head better of every single data point in my perception. I was like, how did he get it so? This is somebody I just met. He got it perfect, but it was really good information. And then I could really untangle my reaction and go, oh, he didn't mean any of that. He didn't even know me. He just happened to hit the nail on the head for every one of the things that I feel like is important and every one of my values. But he had no idea. And then I could react to the person very differently when we met again. So it's really practical, this thing. And like I said, I do it with my own emotional episodes. I know there's a Buddhist rumor that nuns are perfect and we never get emotional. And it's so not true. I don't know if anybody in this room still held on to that wrong view about everybody in robes is perfect and unemotional, but it's not true. So it really helps to kind of break it down. So I urge you to kind of keep working with this, especially with that perception database, especially looking at what's constructive and destructive. And it's interesting in that situation, was yelling at the person and letting him know that you were there, I don't know that that was destructive. I think that was probably a good idea because it got him out of there, and maybe that was the only way you could have done it. So it's not always that even reacting strongly is necessarily destructive if it accomplishes. And we'll take a little break, and then we're going to look at anger, which is an interesting one. And when we respond angrily, even like that, that could have been very constructive to call 911. It may have taken too long. He might have already harmed your daughter, or who knows what could have happened. Maybe just banging on the window and shouting was very constructive in that situation. So it's not always about, oh, it's kind of intense, it must be destructive. Maybe that's what needed to happen, and it would have taken too long if you just called the police. Probably smart to do it later because you don't want somebody lurking around and climbing in people's bedroom windows. But, in the moment, that was probably, even though it was an automatic reaction, probably ended up being constructive. Yeah. Let's take a little break, and then we'll come back and talk about anger. Great. So maybe, let's see, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and look at the emotion of anger and some of the ways we can deal with that. like, oh, if only none of this had happened to me. But that's such a dead end, whereas if you just kind of go, well, okay, it did. How can I deal with this in a way that's hopefully more functional and constructive and, get through it? And then even beyond that, to think of like, could it really help me? Could it help me have more empathy for other people like me? Like, could there be an advantage to this too? Then that can be a really helpful way of dealing with it. Yeah, yeah. I'm fine. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Were you, I'm sorry you were standing there that whole time to ask me if I was cool enough. How sweet. I noticed you closed the door, so I guess everybody's all right. Okay, any other questions about the emotional episode timeline? So as I mentioned before, what we're doing in this 4 nights is a very short version of the Cultivating Emotional Balance. The full training is 42 hours. And so during the full training, we do a lot of meditation practice. We're going to do a bit of meditation practice tonight and tomorrow night, which is our last night. But also what we do in the full course is chart out our emotional episodes over and over and over again during the whole 42 hours, just to get a lot of practice doing it. It's also fun to chart an enjoyable emotion because it's got the same parts. And we always do that the last day of the 42-hour class kind of as dessert, because then everybody, it's been like sadness and anger and like all of these ones that are just hard, and then I'm like, okay, pick one of the 16 enjoyable emotions and map that out, and everybody sort of capers around giggling, which is much more fun. So I don't think we'll have time for that too. I shouldn't have told you that story. Now we're not going to have time to do that. So sorry, wah. Come to California and do the whole 42 hours with me next March. So we'll look at the emotion of anger. We've got the 7 universal emotions, and they're called the universals because there's a universal signal in terms of the facial expression, and they all have a function. But we'll look at anger especially because I think a lot of us can agree that it is maybe of the 7, the one most likely to end up leading to a destructive emotional episode for ourselves, destructive for ourselves, destructive to others. One of the universal emotions is also contempt, which is rarely constructive. But we'll look at anger because we might feel anger more often than we feel contempt, depending on who we are. So there's a theme for anger, and that's being thwarted in pursuit of a goal that matters to you. So this is kind of the general theme of anger: interference, something getting in the way of you and your goals. Could be physical, think of road rage. It could be, somebody else getting the promotion at work. It could be any number of kind of different, stimulus of that, but that's kind of the universal theme. Anger controls, punishes, and retaliates. So that's often what we do with anger, none of which are terrific. It's interesting to look at anger. The word anger, and I can say this in Kurukulla Center, often we do cultivating emotional balance in more secular settings, but I know a lot of people, maybe most of you in this room, have some Buddhist background, and you might be thinking, wait, there's nothing beneficial about anger. How can you say that there could be any kind of function or usefulness? Because we're used to these phrases, and this comes directly from Master Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Even a moment of anger destroys eons of virtue. And then every time we're just kind of like ticked off at our roommate for ordering pepperoni on the pizza, we're panic-stricken thinking, oh my God, I just, destroyed eons of virtue. Oh, I just did 3 months retreat, but I got pissed off at my roommate, so there goes my 3-month retreat. There's a book by a Buddhist practitioner and psychologist called Harvey Aronson, and it's called Buddhist Practice on Western Ground. And he's got a huge chapter about attachment, another easily misunderstood idea, and a big chapter on anger. And he said, actually, the word that's used in the Buddhist text. And the English word anger, he said, the word anger in English has a lot of different meanings. He said, it can mean, you know, you get ticked off at your roommate for ordering pepperoni on the pizza. It can mean righteous indignation, you know, a feeling that we have in the face of injustice, right? Like you're protesting injustice. He said it can mean the feeling we get when we feel like our boundaries are not being respected, right? Somebody's just kind of not paying attention to some boundary that you're trying to set. And he said it can mean some intent to harm. And he said it's only the last one that Buddhism says is so terrible and it will destroy eons of karma. So it's only that intense kind of anger that wants to harm and, you know, either physically, verbally, whatever. So don't think that when you're upset at, you know, the multinational corporation trying to put the pipeline under the river and you feel like flying to North Dakota like I did about 2 weeks ago to protest, that there's anything wrong with that, as long as it doesn't include a wish to harm. And I've had several conversations with people about a particular political candidate recently and how to maintain compassion for this person in the face of these things. And that's kind of it. It's the difference between the action and the person. You know, it's like keeping compassion for people, but you can protest in action. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you can stand up, or if your boundaries aren't being respected, or whatever it may be. So don't feel like, because this often happens with Buddhist practitioners, and that's why I'm given this warning here at Kurukulla Center, that being a Buddhist means you have to be a doormat and you can never stand up to things, and you can't yell out the window at the intruder and throw the stick and call the police. It doesn't mean any of those things, because often that's the most functional thing to do, and sometimes doing it in a way that might seem quite intense is, you know, perfectly okay in Buddhism, right? So that's a wrong view and a misunderstanding. Just because the English word anger means all those different varieties of things, and, you know, Buddhism still says, yes, but intent to harm is not a good thing. You know, that is negative karma, especially intent to harm someone who's shown you great kindness. You know, and Master Shantideva talks about harming a bodhisattva, you know, one of these beings who's shown like great kindness. That's especially heavy, right? Because this is someone who's benefiting all beings. But just to talk about the terminology a little bit with this, anger often calls forth more anger. And this is a big discussion I have with Paul Ekman all the time, because he says, if someone's angry at you, you'll always get angry back. And I go, no, you won't. You know, he goes, you have to be a saint not to get angry when somebody is angry at you in your face. You know, but he's not a Buddhist practitioner, so we have this discussion. But, you know, anger often calls forth more anger. Hard not to respond to anger with anger. I mean, it's true, it's hard, but it's certainly not impossible. And then I tell him stories of Buddhist practitioners, and he kind of rolls his eyes at me. So that's the difference between the Western psychological view and the Buddhist view. So why do we most, you know, anger is one of the emotions that we most kind of want to get a handle on, most want to change, because it can quickly hurt others, both psychologically and physically. Anybody in this room, I'm going to ask for a show of hands, ever said anything to anyone under the control of your anger that you regret and that damaged your relationship beyond repair? Yeah, see? Oh, some people aren't raising their hands. Maybe you're younger than the rest of us, I'm not sure. So often, you know, we can think of times that it is. I mean, hopefully people in this room aren't punching people in the nose, you know, constantly. But verbally, right, we can, you know, say things that are, you know, definitely damaging to the relationship. Is the hurtfulness built in, or is it learned? And I think this is one of the things that, you know, we don't always have to say those words, but sometimes we do learn, you know, there is sometimes a style of anger that I think is learned, maybe. in our upbringing. There can be the kind of withdrawing, the withdrawing cold shoulder anger. There can be the going ballistic anger, all these different sort of styles of anger that can be learned. Many people are taught not to express anger, and anger is one of the ones that tends to be quite gendered. More okay for men to express anger than women, in general. Might be changing with the younger generation, but still seems to be quite gendered, that it's kind of more acceptable, for men to display anger than women. Often if we do express our anger, we feel guilt and shame about it. For some, they feel like their anger can get out of control, so they have a lot of fear around their anger. They feel like they can be very easily triggered. And Paul Ekman, one of the developers of this training, he'd never seen Cultivating Emotional Balance taught. And so he came and sat in on a day when I was teaching with his daughter Eve earlier this year. It was in August, and he talked quite movingly about his own anger. And he said he'd always, experienced and mostly expressed anger every day of his life. And then he talked quite movingly about meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the first time. And he says, for 7 months after meeting His Holiness, I did not have one episode of anger. He said it lasted for 7 months, and he's not a Buddhist at all, not religious at all. He describes himself as a Jewish atheist. But he said, and we were asking, we were like, why? And he said, it was just this goodness. I met somebody who just embodied goodness, but it was so moving because he said he was there with his wife, and he said, my whole life I've gotten angry every day, right, Marianne? And she's like, yep, And then he said for 7 months, and he couldn't believe it. Like, he couldn't even believe it himself. And then he said, it kind of wore off, and now he and His Holiness are friends, and they hang out, and, they have this beautiful relationship. But I thought that was, like, so amazing, because it's like, in the power of, the presence of someone like that, it can really have, like, this huge kind of influence. So he talks a lot about, how he's struggled with his own anger, and that it has given rise to fear because he has done, just felt overwhelmed by the emotion. So anger, we say, is a whole family of emotions. So let's brainstorm some anger family words. Any anger family, like the whole broad spectrum, just call them out. Irritated, great. Annoyed, furious, frustration, aggravation, great. Impatience. This is like the mild end of the spectrum, you guys. Rage, here we go. Great. What? Furious. Indignation. Okay. What else? Apoplectic. Wow. That's a little physiological, isn't it? Okay. Anything else? Yeah, so we got like this spectrum of, how about just plain old mad? I'm mad. Yeah, I'm angry, I'm mad, I'm pissed off. So we've got like the sort of irritated, annoyed end of the spectrum, and the furious rage end of the spectrum. So it's a whole, it's a lot of different emotions, kind of go into that anger family of emotions. And then they're, all kind of triggered by the same thing, and then it just sort of depends on how we react to those triggers. Any kind of interference, right? Of any kind. Marianne is thinking of an example right now.
When your boss calls or texts and you're like,
Yeah.
Can't you see I'm busy?
Yeah. So even like that kind of interruption, like you're in the middle of a task and you get interrupted, that would be another kind of interference. What would be another example of interference? Well, the road rage thing, right? Somebody cutting you off in traffic would be interference. Can anybody else think of an example of an interference? Yeah, you just are on your lunch break and you've got your agenda, and then there's this like long queue. What about control freaks that try and like take over what you're doing and do it their way? Maybe? What do you think? Yeah, so lots of those. Very, very prompting. And so that universal theme of like, you're obstructed in your goal, this like really relates to that kind of interference. Someone trying to hurt us, right? So anybody trying, or our daughter, right? So you yell out the window, somebody trying to harm us. Another person's anger, and this is where Paul Ekman says, almost impossible not to feel angry in the face of someone else's anger directed towards us. Injustice, and this is that other definition of the word anger. You know, you see something that seems unfair. When I was younger, I don't do it so much anymore, although I have been known to do. You know, watch out anybody who is like beating up their girlfriend, child, or pet in front of me. You know, I just sort of like swell to 3 times my normal size, which is already really huge. And it usually was pretty effective because I just tear in there and stop it, you know. And unfortunately, not with compassion towards the perpetrator. I think I deal with a little bit differently now. I still sort of tear in and interfere, but, you know, hopefully with a little more compassion. But hard to see that kind of injustice and not react and respond, right? Disappointment in how a person has acted. Oh boy, anybody ever experienced anger behind them? So one of the interesting ways of dealing with anger, I always think, is check your expectation. And that unwritten, unspoken, unsigned contract you have with that other person about their behavior. Right? They're clueless, and you're disappointed and angry and giving them the cold shoulder, and they're like, what? What did I do? I have no idea what I did, right? So I think, you know, one of the ways of dealing with our anger is if you feel like a lot of your anger prompts are about disappointment, you know, just a little more communication. Even if you feel like, oh, if they really loved me, they would read my mind, and they would just know exactly what I wanted in any given moment. You're just setting yourself up, you know, for total, I mean, I'm just telling you, you know, it's true. You're just setting yourself up for some bitter disappointment and maybe some destructive anger episodes, to use Cultivating Emotional. Ooh, betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. And this is so evolutionary. I really think about this one. And it's like in those tribes and troops of hunter-gatherers that we've evolved, our emotions evolved for that scenario because that was going on for so long. In the last couple of 100 years of post-industrial revolution, our emotional evolution has not caught up at all. I mean, our emotions are still like, you know, San, Bushman, Kalahari Desert. That's our emotional repertoire. So in that situation, if you were abandoned, rejected, I mean, the worst thing in most traditional culture is exile and rejection and banishment and shunning and all those things, because you'll die, mostly, right? If you're kicked out of the tribe. So I really look at this in myself because I often, I mean, I have all kinds of perceptual database stuff about rejection and abandonment. And I often, you know, before studying this would think, why is it so heavy? Who cares if that person, you know, in an intimate relationship, when I used to have those, maybe that's why I'm a Buddhist nun now, who cares if they break up with me? I'm not going to die. It feels like you're going to die. Because like mostly you did before for like millions of years, you know? So really looking at how primal that thing is, I think is so interesting. And then again, like I was saying before, the anger being a secondary emotion to that sheer vulnerability of rejection, betrayal, and abandonment. Like that's doesn't get more vulnerable than that, like very primally and evolutionarily. And so we get angry so that we don't have to feel that level of vulnerability. So that's, to me, that's a really interesting one to look at. Being falsely accused, that's also terrific, isn't it? You know, when you're falsely accused for something that you don't feel that you've done. Somebody else breaks a cultural rule. Think about somebody cutting in line. You know, how there are these cultural rules and somebody breaks it. That's when we have to be super sensitive to other cultural rules. Like in multicultural North America, trying to educate ourselves a little bit about other cultural rules. This one, I laughed so hard. I was traveling, I think it was in India for about 6 months once. And in India, any of you who've traveled in India, like there's no such thing as personal space. You know, everybody is just standing right next to everyone else. I actually had an entire family sit in my lap on a bus once because the bus was really crowded. And so the wife and the 2 children, the husband is like, there's a lot of room there. And I'm kind of like, seriously? This is really happening. I've got the family in my lap. I could not make this up. I could not make this up. I was like, okay, wow. So anyway, I've been in India, and I was going to New Zealand, because I was living most of the time in New Zealand at that point. So I was going to New Zealand after 6 months in India, and I flew from like some weird routing, like Kathmandu to Delhi to Bangkok to Auckland, New Zealand. So there I am in Auckland, and I'm waiting in the luggage area, like for my luggage and the baggage claim. And I noticed me and these 2 Indian guys that had just gotten off the plane were standing like, you know, we'd just gotten off the plane from India, so we're kind of like waiting for our bags. And then we're kind of like looming over this like New Zealand guy, like I didn't even think about it. We're kind of just standing, like breathing down his neck. We're all just like waiting for the bags, and I noticed him kind of going, and then finally he's just like, could you just back off? And we're kind of like, what? It was hysterical. I just realized, oh wow. Okay, I've been in India for a long time, like doing that same culture. But the Kiwi guy is just kind of like, oh my God, you know. And then in Australia, like, oh my God, I don't know if anybody is in here. Talk about personal space. Like they have a giant country with a lot of room. So I noticed all the times I'm in Australia, I'm just trying to talk to somebody, and I would keep like walking towards them, and they would keep like backing up, because you just kind of shout at each other across like the paddock, you know, at like 50 yards, and I was like, always, you know, every Australian I talked to would back up. So it's interesting breaking the cultural rules, like, you know, just kind of understanding when you're doing that. And it's hard, like you just kind of go, okay, this is America, but yeah, what does that mean? Like there's so many different cultures in learning, but how we can get so angry if we feel like somebody's like broken the rules, like the guy in the baggage claim in Auckland, poor thing. So destructive, angry behaviors, retaliation, right? So attacking back, stonewalling, terrible. And this refers to just giving somebody the cold shoulder, just completely shutting down, like especially in intimate relationships, you know, your spouse just, you know, we're not talking about it, just shuts down completely and doesn't engage. Anger, we can express anger constructively when it prevents harm to ourselves or others. But it's dangerous, as it could start a cycle of violence. But one constructive anger we talked about before, disciplining a child, you know, getting them not to run into the street, that's going to actually like teach them. I'm a hippie, and there was my generation of people when we had children. All of my friends, I never had kids. I think I would have done the same thing. There was this thing of, oh, you can't discipline them because it's mean. And then there was this whole generation of these unbelievable spoiled brat kids that would just do all these things. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Maybe, I'm from California, it was probably worse there than Boston, of this, like, it's mean to discipline thing, which was just a disaster, because these kids didn't even know how to behave. I mean, they'd never been taught how to behave. So you don't have to do it with anger, but it's sort of the extreme of that thing. Sometimes it can be constructive. But must be directed at the action and not the person. So, right? So that kind of, it's not okay, not you're not okay, that action is not okay. So it's fine to set strong limits, but not to attack the person. Okay. And then it can motivate change. It alerts you to something in your life needs to change. And this is an interesting, our own internal anger is a signal to us. That's its evolutionary function. I'm being blocked from something I want. Sometimes that's the first sign in your life that something needs to change, is your own emotion of anger that arises. So it can be a really good clue to you. Hey, something needs to change. Something needs to be different. And then the face of anger, so you can see on the left, the lips pressed together, the brow kind of furrowed, the eyes kind of glaring, and then that's kind of an extreme anger face there on the right. Any questions about the kind of the prompts of anger, what's constructive and destructive, anything to clarify about anger?
Passive aggressiveness fit into the whole scheme.
Yeah, well, that's another way that our anger can be expressed. So it's kind of retaliation with a twist. It's not punching somebody in the face, but it's doing something, in an underhanded way almost to get back at them. So I think it's another form of retaliation. It isn't quite as straightforward as yelling and hitting, but it's retaliation, another form of that. Yeah, and that's like when you're met with passive-aggressive behavior, I find that's really hard not to react with anger when I feel like that's happening. I'd almost rather have them yell at me than undermine me in some kind of underhanded way, right? Yeah.
What about not necessarily stonewalling or giving somebody a cold shoulder, but just sort of acknowledging that you need your own space right now?
Yeah.
You don't want any interaction.
And we'll talk about that, we've got a kind of a technique, and I realize with the timing we're not going to finish with anger. We'll have to do a little bit more tomorrow night too. In fact, let's do that now, because a wise break, guidelines for a wise break, we can skip ahead for that. Because sometimes, because of that selective filtering period, this is the smartest thing that we can do in a relationship. It's not just cutting them off, it's just saying, okay, I just need some space. It's not really going to be productive to talk about this right now, so let's just take a break, for a while. Tell the other person that you want to take kind of a wise break in order to avoid being hurtful. So it's about communication, really. You tell the other person, negotiate how long you'll be gone. So it's not just like, I had a friend, this poor friend, he used to be a monk, and then he got married, and then his relationship broke up. And the last I heard, he'd gone on like 32 internet dates, like Tinder or swiping to the right or something that happens these days with people. And I was like, oh my God, can you even imagine 32 blind dates? Well, one of them kind of made it to engagement, actually. That might have been number 10 of 32. And you know that there were 22 after that one, so you can imagine what happened. And his partner, when they would have a conflict, she would just disappear. And she would check into the Motel 6 and not answer her phone. Right? So in a way, she knew that they needed a break, but she wasn't doing it smart, and she wasn't telling him. Meanwhile, he's like, is she ever coming back? What's happening? Are we ever going to be able to deal with it? So negotiating, and then if you need more time, always come back at the agreed upon time. If you're still worked up, communicate again and say, I need more time. So it's really all about communication, and it's not check into the Motel 6 for a week. That usually will trigger even more, upset in the person. But it really is, I think the difference between that and stonewalling is mostly about communication. Don't drink, drive, or use drugs while you're on the break. Don't ruminate on how you're right, and rehearse what you're going to say when you come back. Break means break. And then practice what you've learned to increase your relaxation and your awareness. Okay, so that's the difference between kind of stonewalling and just dealing in a smart way with the selective filtering period. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I know.
Just that this is really helpful, because
Good.
Because I tend
Yeah.
to just walk out. Be like, I know I need a break, I'm gonna walk out.
Yeah.
But I had just a comment about the one of your other slides, the earlier slides, about the taking, about constructive,
Yeah.
the constructive process, like being upset with the action and not the not the person.
Not the person. Yeah.
That's that type of technique is in a lot of child parenting books,
Mm.
and I found it very helpful with the kids because a lot of times if you're angry at the child for some, like, scribbling on the wall or something like that, I mean sometimes, like, I would get upset. I would get upset at my daughter or my son, and then I'd have to step back and say, okay, like when I talk to them, I have to be like, I love you, but I'm upset with your actions of scribbling. So that way they don't get a complex. It's very helpful in diffusing,
That's right.
direct
That's right.
anger,
Yeah.
or they might interpret it as, oh, mommy doesn't love me,
Yeah.
So, or that person, or in a relationship, oh, that, she doesn't love me, but no, actually, it's just the behavior,
And
that can get really confusing, but I think that really clarifies.
Clarifies.
Yeah.
Because I think one thing that can happen when we feel like somebody's angry at us is then we feel rejected and abandoned. Then we react to our rejection and abandonment by becoming even more angry, and the whole thing can just snowball and escalate. Whereas if the person can come and just go, wow, when you didn't call me when you were going to come home, and you told me you were going to come home from dinner, and you didn't call me, and that was really hard for me. But you're not just going, you're just a jerk, and you're not reacting to the person, you're just really naming the behavior. And I think this is where we can use some of these communication techniques from other modalities to really help. And I'm a big fan of Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication for talking about difficult stuff with people in ways that isn't triggering of them getting defensive and reactive. Because like you say, if we can separate out our, even our commentary, or just trying to set a new limit, or trying to let person, know the way that the behavior made us feel, from direct attacks at them as a person, whether it's your kids, your spouse, your friends, whoever it may be, huge difference in how constructive it is. Big difference, I think, in how constructive it can be. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
Could you speak a little bit about the connection between anger in this example and the ego? And I raise that because in anger, I feel like the ego is there's a strong connection there.
Yeah.
So it feels this out of control thing that is not, that it's further away from the center of who I really think I am.
Yeah.
So the bigger the ego is, I feel the more that anger is manifesting itself.
Yeah.
And as I try to work to make that ego smaller. It's a much less frequent occurrence for me. As I've tried to do that work. So
Right.
help.
And the word ego means so many different things. It's really interesting because once you bring up that word, it's kind of like, what sense are we talking about ego? the psychoanalytic ego. Sometimes psychologists talk about the functional ego and then the self-representational ego. So there's the functional ego that's just our unified sense of who we are, an integrated, functioning me. Yes, I'm going to work, I'm eating lunch, like no problem with that idea. There's more of a problem with, especially in Buddhism, with what we call the self-representational ego, and that's like a really strong, concrete idea of who I am. Yeah, and we say, again, putting my Buddhist hat on, that often leads to so much of our actions, and well, so much, first of all, of our attachment and aversion, and then the actions that are, in response to attachment and aversion, especially anger, when we don't feel like others are reflecting our view of ourselves and giving us enough ego-gratifying feedback, right? Sometimes I think like what we call life is this dance to invoke positive ego-gratifying feedback and ward off any threats to our ego. And that's mostly our agenda 24/7, is like, I was joking over the weekend, we were talking about this a little bit, and I said there's this rule of like, I'll smile at you so you'll smile back at me and I'll feel good about myself, or I'll tell you a joke so you'll laugh at me and I'll feel clever and witty. And it's this dance. I mean, Americans are the worst. It's like really cultural. Southern Europeans could care less. You're like, and they're just going, it's great. Other cultures, they're just not doing the dance of smile at me and I'll smile at you and we'll all feel good and be, oh. But it's so much of what we do. And I think often our anger is when we're disappointed in that agenda. So remember I said like anger, one of the triggers is disappointment in the expectation. And so like we kind of have this rule about the world that everyone will feed our ego and nobody will possibly do anything to undermine or threaten it. And then when that like unspoken contract gets disappointed by people, we're so angry, So I think it's that. It's that, when I was in a long meditation retreat and I was talking to a friend of mine after this long retreat, and we both realized that the thing that was the hardest about being in solitude for as long as we were is not one shred of ego-gratifying feedback was forthcoming, because we're in solitude. And I think that's the hardest thing about solitude and silence for people. We're so addicted to that ego-gratifying feedback, and then when we don't get it, we're angry. Whether it's just an absence of it from the people that we're expecting it from, or actually somebody blaming, criticizing, falsely accusing. So yeah, huge, I think, like prompt for that angry response. You opened up we could talk about ego for, the next week and a half, but yeah, that's kind of the short version of the answer. Yeah, okay. Anything else? Yes, Chris.
I just have like a 20-second funny story about that. Is that
Yeah.
In my job, I go to different job sites, and one of them is a doctor's office with a bunch of women. And I realize I like going there because they're all very nice and they satisfy that ego. And the one person I don't like is the one lady that doesn't smile at me.
Yeah.
And I realized that I was like, oh, okay, it's me, not them. And that's exactly what the story is.
Yeah, isn't it amazing? It's just like, oh God, that person. And then you just realize you're not just getting your ego needs met, and they're not doing anything at all wrong. They're just not playing the game at all, Or different cultures. I was reading once of someone who went to be she was going to be a school teacher. She was from Anglo culture, and she went to the Navajo res to be a school teacher. And a lot of native culture, they just don't do that smiley American thing. And so she was so confused at the beginning, because she would do her signals of like, and she just wasn't getting it back like at all. And she was just, and the emotions that came up, it was like a memoir of her experience on the res, and this whole like emotional thing that was coming up for her as she realized what was going on. And then she just felt like, I have to leave. I mean, it was this whole like real primal kind of panicky, it's not working. kind of thing, which, sometimes I think does make us uncomfortable in other cultures when our signals aren't getting the right feedback. And often it's to do with ego. So, yeah, it can be really interesting. Yeah. All right. We're out of time. We didn't have time to do this practice that I wanted to do with you, but we'll do it tomorrow night. We'll do the rain, the practice for dealing with strong emotions. That was the response to your question, and just how can we bring more mindfulness so we can be less reactive. Another thing I wanted to do tomorrow, we'll talk more about how to bring awareness to the emotional episode timeline. I also wanted to talk about a group of practices that we do in the longer Cultivating Emotional Balance that some of you may be familiar with under the terminology, the 4 immeasurables. Alan Wallace calls these the 4 virtues of the heart. And it's these meditation practices borrowed from Buddhism for the Cultivating Emotional Balance training. And we'll look at these: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So some of you are familiar from your Buddhist practice, and we'll look at how this relates to cultivating emotional balance and the interrelationship. There's this really cool way that these 4 practices relate to each other and kind of correct for each other when they're getting out of balance. And I wanted to introduce that to you all too. So we'll try and do two shorter practices, meditation practices tomorrow night, finish up a little bit of, how to bring awareness to the emotional episode timeline, and then talk about the 4 immeasurables and do a practice with that as well. Lord Buddha, but it's Alan Wallace that calls them those. He uses that terminology, the 4 virtues of the heart. Okay, so thank you all for your attention. Come back tomorrow night and we'll get into it some more. Thank you.